A long, long time ago, I started making notes about similarities in various science fiction universes, such as Star Trek, Star Wars, Babylon 5, Stargate, and even others. And now I'm here to compare Star Trek and Star Wars. I'm Joey, and this is UNIMULTIVERSE Archives, Star Trek and Star Wars Cosmic Evolution, Archive 1. I've always found the idea that science fiction worlds borrow from and inspire each other, and as long as they acknowledge parallel universes, they could be treated as parallel universes of each other. This time I'm going to be focusing on the ancient species that affected evolution throughout the galaxies of Star Trek and Star Wars. There are definitely some similarities in these two universes. In the last few years, I haven't gotten around to reading as many novels as I used to. While I hadn't been paying as close attention to the Star Wars novels and comics in a little while, I was pleasantly surprised to discover a whole new era of the Star Wars Legacy universe. Whoops, did I say Star Wars Legacy universe? I meant to say Star Wars Legends universe. It's now the Star Wars Legends universe. Yeah, the Star Wars Legends. How could I ever made a mistake like calling it Star Wars Legacy Universe? A whole new era of the Star Wars Legacy Universe has been featured in some of the novels and comics, the very, very, very distant past, including new information on the species who were active at that time, such as this species. I'm not sure how to pronounce their name. Okay, I'm really not sure if I should pronounce the Kwa, the K-W-A, is how they're spelled, K-W-A. I'm not sure if I should pronounce them Kwa, or Quay, or exactly what emphasis there should be on that A at the end, or for all I know, it could be Kewa. But to further add to my confusion on how I really should pronounce it, what letters should be emphasized, there's a subspecies of this race that their name is spelled KWI. Alright, discussing the subject matter portrayed in fictional universes is basically what I do here. So, what would be more perfect fictional universes to compare than Star Trek and Star Wars? And I'm going to focus on the Star Trek Expanded Universe, mainly the universe portrayed in the novels, and also the equivalent of Star Wars, which would be the Star Wars Legacy Universe. Whoops, there's that error again. Well, you know what? The Star Wars Legends universe is the Star Wars Legacy universe, because it includes Star Wars Legacy. Yeah, that's my excuse. It used to be previously known as the Star Wars Expanded Universe. So I'm going to start with Star Trek. And where else to start but the beginning of the universe, point in time when space began to expand from the primordial singularity, the Big Bang. Both the Star Trek and Star Wars universes acknowledge the Big Bang. Star Trek has spent a lot more time mentioning it, though. And of course, we at one point, even in a fully canonical episode of Star Trek Voyager, known as Death Wish, we actually saw the Big Bang. Of course, since we saw it from outside the event, we actually saw it taking place. That means that traveling back to the Big Bang, which was the result of Q. Q was the one that allowed for this. Q must have took a pocket of space and time back with him so the Big Bang could be viewed. But many, many points and many, many times in Star Trek, the Big Bang has been referenced. In Star Wars, it's been referenced to be, a fair bit of time in the past. Both universes portray it as being over 13 billion years into the past. But moving along from the Big Bang into the early universe, allowing for just enough time for sentient life to evolve. The evolution of the Q. The Star Trek Q Continuum books. They exist as normal paperbacks, but there's also a trade paperback version known as the Signature Edition. Any references to page numbers I use here, I'll be referencing the Signature Edition. In that series, we learn Q himself is somewhere in the area of about 7 billion years old. In the past, in the very distant past, we see Q looking at the Guardian of Forever. And the Guardian of Forever seems to be created by the creatures the Q species evolved from, The Guardian of Forever is more than 6 billion years old, most likely more than 7 billion years old, actually. In the signature edition of the Q Continuum books, I'd look to pages 115 and 131. Pages 114 and 115, Q takes Picard to the Guardian of Forever. Picard knows that in his time the Guardian of Forever is at least 6 billion years old, maybe more. The young version of Q that they see in the past, but they don't interact with, is discontent with the Q civilization and comments that at least his ancestors made things, seeming to indicate that his ancestors made the Guardian of Forever. Pages 116 and 117, the young Q uses the Guardian of Forever to see something, not of the usual universe or universes, that he has never seen before. This is where Q meets Zero. Page 131, Q directly states that his organic precursors had built a temple on the same world as the Guardian of Forever. This kind of backs up the idea that the Q evolved from organic creatures and supports the idea that the Guardian of Forever and other objects on this planet were built by the Q's ancestors. Page 55 indicates that Q's son is the first Q born since the Q transcended physical existence eons ago. Amanda Rogers is also referred to. However, she was born as a human. So it's quite possible that Q, or the species that evolved into becoming the Q, may have been from one of the worlds that were one of the very first worlds to form life in the universe. They'd have to be incredibly old and incredibly advanced to evolve into anything like the Q, to actually break free from the bonds of space and time. Page 81, Q is playing with energy and space and time, and he creates the Nexus, the very same Nexus that is featured in Star Trek Generations. Page 274, we see the creation of the barrier at the center of the galaxy. It was created by the Q. Page 276, we see the creation of the galactic barrier, the barrier at the outside edge of the galaxy. It was also created by the Q. And in these books, it's portrayed that the Q had created this barrier as a shield that would keep out beings such as Zero. Page 169. Betazoids are stated to be even more vulnerable to the effects of the galactic barrier than humans, due to Betazoids' telepathic powers. Then in page 185, Vulcans are immune to the effects of the galactic barrier, even though Vulcans have telepathic powers. Again, on page 257, it is stated that the Vulcans are immune to the effects of the galactic barrier. On page 350, the powers that empower humans and Betazoids when they're exposed to the galactic barrier and change as a result of it, is called a little piece of Q. This does keep in line, or at least somewhat in line, with the ideas of Star Trek The Next Generation, Q squared. And also, if you were to compare Star Trek to Star Wars, the manner in which humans are altered by the galactic barrier, it's kind of like they develop force powers, incredible psychokinetic powers. Page 99. The species that lived on Targus 3, 2 billion years ago, appeared to be the same species that seeded the galaxy with DNA to encourage the evolution of humanoid life. Many novels assume those beings to still be around long after that time period and refer to them as the preservers. They may be the same original humanoids that seeded the galaxy, or perhaps they're just a very similar species. Whether they are the original species or an entirely new one that just looks alike, either way, the same species that lived on Targus 3 2 billion years ago are different than the ones that live on Targus 3 in the 24th century. It's worth noting that in the universe of the William Shatner novels, it wasn't the Q, but actually the preservers that created the galactic barrier. Although at this time I'm focusing on the timeline of the Q Continuum and the Gateway books, which most novels based on Star Trek tend to fit in that timeline, more so than the William Shatner novels timeline. Iconian history, over 200,000 years before the Terran Common Era. The Iconians would have no doubt had a heavy effect on the galaxy a long time ago. definitely a distant background civilization that would have had an effect on the technological evolution of the galaxy would be the Iconians and any relics left behind by them. Star Trek Gateways, What Lay Beyond, audiobook, Disc 2, tracks 24 and 25. Q tells Janeway the story of how the Q allowed the Iconians to gain a basic Q technology that could be used to develop their advanced gateways. The Iconian gateways are considered to be little more than a child's toy to the Q. These gateway stories are important to the overall Star Trek timeline featured in pocket books because they connect to the Star Trek Deep Space Nine relaunch stories. Star Trek The Next Generation, The Devil's Heart, pages 1 to 3. When the Iconians first made contact with alien life, the philosopher Senega, I'm not sure how his name is pronounced, warned that the superior technology of the Iconians could unsettle other races. Senega had once called the gem known as the Devil's Heart a curse rather than a blessing. Seems this gem, the Devil's Heart, was responsible for the Iconians learning to develop their advanced technology, and in later pages, the gem turns out to be made of the same material as the Guardian of Forever. In the Q Continuum books, the ancestors of the Q made the Guardian of Forever. In the Gateway series, Q allowed the Iconians to access Q technology, thus how they created their gateways. So this gem could be a simple toy that the Q allowed the Iconians to have, thus enabling them to develop their advanced technology. The Devil's Heart granted insights to those whom had it, and the Devil's Heart ended up on Vulcan in the distant past. It is possible that it ended up there during Vulcan's first contact with alien life. Directly stated in Star Trek Enterprise that when the Vulcans first went out into space, space wasn't quite as heavily populated, and humans were dealing with more hostile alien life than the Vulcans had to deal with when they were new to space. However, according to the novels, Vulcan's first contact was a hostile one when the Orions invaded. This happened at a point when the Vulcans were already able to travel their own star system, but not yet had warp drive. Star Trek Star Charts, page 52, for the Vulcans' first contact or warp-capable date. That would place it around 320 CE, Contemporary Era, or Common Era, on the Terran calendar. Vulcan's first contact. Most likely Orion pirates, and clearly stated to be Orion pirates in Spock's world. Spock's world is sometimes a little bit hard to meld in with the overall timeline of Star Trek books, so Spock's world could be dismissed as an alternate universe, but there's also the Ryanasu books. They're basically books that deal with the history of the Romulans, and that series also references in the Orion pirates. So we could say that in this expanded universe of Star Trek, Orion pirates are Vulcan's first contact. They played a role in the development of the Vulcans, the oldest and most advanced species to found the Federation. Although I am less familiar with this, some of the Star Trek role-playing books apparently have referenced that the Orions are excellent sources of information when finding relics from the Iconian civilization. So the Iconians may have influenced the Orions, and quite possibly that might be how the Devil's Heart got onto Vulcan, because at one time it was there on planet Vulcan. And of course I have been archiving some data on the Star Wars universe. With Star Wars, let's start with something a little more recent and then work our way into the past. The Dark Nest trilogy. The Killiks? I think that's how it's pronounced. I have a urge just to pronounce it Click? I don't know. Click? But the Killiks, an ancient insectoid species, basically has a very long history that goes back long enough they had interaction with the Rakata, Infinite Empire. We're getting back to the original first empires to travel space. These guys would have been there at the early days of galactic civilization before, the Galactic Republic or the Old Republic or whatever. So these guys most likely had interaction with the Rakata. And the Rakata were one of my favorite alien species featured in my favorite video game on the Xbox, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. Now, the Rakata were really interesting to me because it looked like we finally saw the original hyperspace aliens, the aliens that brought hyperspace travel to the galaxy. And the Rakata figured out a way to travel through hyperspace, and it somehow tapped into the Force. The Rakata were, unfortunately, very good at using the dark side of the Force, but they might have been a little bit one-sided in the Force. They were the original hyperspace aliens, so it appeared, and possibly the original species to spread out across the galaxy. And possibly, because, I don't know, personally I think humans evolved on Earth, because they did evolve on Earth, although Star Wars could be a completely parallel universe where there is no Earth. But the Rakata could have been responsible for getting humans to Coruscant. And of course, humans weren't the only really old species on Coruscant. It could have been that the other species that had been there had evolved first. The Rakata could explain so much. And I thought they were actually pretty interesting species on their own. They once spread out across space, displacing and subjugating other species, possibly moving them around, changing worlds, traveling space with a special hyperdrive that tapped into the Force and was guided by the Force. And then at some point they underwent some sort of massive plague, which probably mutated their mitochondria, or midichlorians. Losing this Force power, they lost their ability to travel space, they became severely weakened, but their hyperdrive technology had been backwards engineered by humans who encountered it, and eventually humans, long after this history was forgotten, had developed into the Old Republic and the Galactic Republic, which eventually becomes the Empire and all that wonderful stuff. So the Rakata were the mysterious hyperspace aliens. But then we find out there's a little bit more to the Rakata. Now, personally, when I first read the Dark Nest books, I thought that the Celestials were turning out to be the Rakata. In fact, some of the Star Wars guides had outright said that the Rakata were the Celestials, before the writers of the Star Wars novels and the comics published by Dark Horse, before they had gotten around to really going into a lot of great detail on the Celestials. The Rakata were not the Celestials. The Rakata were not the original species to bring advanced technology across the galaxy. The Rakata once had contact with a species more advanced than themselves, and I guess apparently their first contact with alien life. I really wish I was reading more novels at the time, because I really wish I had gotten around to reading this a long time ago. Here I am just looking this up on Wikipedia and Wikipedia until I finally get around to reading the books. But the Rakata, they're the species that made them the Star Wars equivalent to Star Trek's warp capable, or made them contact with alien life, were, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly, the Kwa? Spelled K-W-A? Kwa? Kwa? I guess it may be pronounced Kwa. Basically, while the Rakata were a species of vicious amphibian humanoids, the Kwa were some humanoid reptiles that were actually pretty good at using the light side of the Force. They're fairly passive. And how they made their way to the Rakata homeworld? Stargates! Yeah, the Stargate. Oh, we can't call them Stargates. Stargates has already been used. Well, even before Stargate has been used, Gateway was kind of used, the Iconian gateways in Star Trek. Alright, so, not gateways, not Stargates, the Infinity Gates. But we're going to be, we just feel like calling them Stargates. And of course, they had a connection to something called Star Temples. The Kwa encountered the Rakata. They sensed that the Rakata were strong in the Force. They used their gateways as a way to transport to the Rakata homeworld, and they introduced the Rakata to the galaxy. So they kind of unleashed that problem onto the galaxy. So the Kwa, these blue humanoid reptiles, who were peaceful, herbivores, really interesting ancient species, they had developed gateways to travel through space. Stargates, which kind of seem even more advanced than star drives. And of course, they didn't do it without encouragement. the Quay had encouragement or connection to a more advanced species called the Celestials. And as far as I can figure, the Celestials appear to be beings who have transcended mortal physical existence and exist as part of the Force. They may be the very first beings to join with the Force and influence its will. So they might not be a specific species. They may have just been beings who evolved early in the universe or early in the galaxy and evolved to the point where they could tap into and become part of this Force. Or maybe within the Force, which is apparently fed energy from all living beings. Perhaps they evolved in the Force itself. Or perhaps they are members of the Kwa, if I'm pronouncing KWA properly. Maybe they were members of that species who a very long time ago ascended to become part of the Force. Much like how some of the ancients of Stargate ascended to become higher beings. Or perhaps we could compare it to the ancestors of the Q. So the KWA, the Kwa, this blue reptilian species, they were the ones that introduced the Rakata to the galaxy. And of course this all goes bad when the Rakata rebel, and they actually managed to fend off and defeat the Celestials. I guess living organisms can beat back the gods. That's pretty impressive for a species of angry amphibians. They actually fended off the Celestials, and the Celestials are credited with creating the technology that created many of the anomalies around the Star Wars galaxy. Possibly even responsible for anomalies around the galaxy that make hyperspace travel outside the galaxy extremely hard. So these Celestials seem to have put up a galactic barrier of sorts. These Celestials have created anomalies within the galaxy itself for reasons that may not be entirely clear. And these Celestials are godlike beings in power and scope, kind of like Gozer or Evo Shandor in Ghostbusters, the ancients of Stargate, or the Q in Star Trek. The Q could be compared. The Q do seem to be the more powerful of these groups, but then again, future information on all these species could throw that all out of balance. So the Celestials, these godlike beings, were actually defeated by the Rakata, but in turn the Rakata lost their Force powers, and wherever the Celestials came from, the Celestials and their intentions are fairly mysterious, but apparently they guided the Kwa, these blue peaceful reptilians. They guided them to travel space to create the Infinity Gates, and the Kwa, they traveled the galaxy. They met new species, and it seems like a very positive thing, the Kwa traveling through space, meeting strange new life forms, new worlds and civilization. Of course, they encountered the Rakata, which, the Rakata wanted their own stargates. The Rakata developed their own star drive, a hyperdrive that would use the Force, and the Rakata managed to rival the gods themselves, rival the Celestials themselves, and create the Infinite Empire, which would eventually fall apart when the Rakata underwent a plague, which seemed to affect their mitochondria, or midichlorians, or whatever, in a way that they lost their ability to tap into the Force, and their Force-based technology not so useful anymore. And then they fell into decline and began to disappear. This strange, ancient, forgotten history of the Star Wars Legends universe, this is what led to humans finding old Rakata star drives, the early hyperdrives, finding a way to backwards engineer them. Humans spreading out, creating the Old Republic, the Galactic Republic. This is the origins of the Star Wars Legends universe. The Celestials kind of started it all. And that kind of parallels the Star Trek universe, where in the Star Trek expanded universe of the novels, the earliest civilizations most likely was whoever evolved to become the Q, and was also the same species that built the Guardian of Forever. And when a Q toy, something that is the same material as the Guardian of Forever, came into the hands of the Iconians, and the Iconians built their own gateways, not nearly as advanced as the Guardian of Forever. And of course the Iconians spread out across space in an ancient time, long before the species of the current Star Trek universe, the current days of the Star Trek universe. So in the ancient histories of both Star Trek and Star Wars, we have Stargates, spreading alien technology around to various worlds. There's a little parallel evolution between the Star Wars and the Star Trek universes. And I think it's some of the more interesting concepts ever put out there in the Star Trek Expanded Universe and the Star Wars Legends universe. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and hopefully you'll check out more. Hey, look behind you! Alright, there was a spaceship in the Star Trek universe that, well, an experimental one in the early days of warp drive that broke through the barriers of space and time, drawing the attention of the Rakata in the Star Wars universe, whose force powers were wearing off. They were losing their force powers. They discovered that if they harvest these humans from other universes, they could mutate their mitochondria into midi-chlorians and then implant them into their cells. But there was an accident, and a multi-dimensional accident.